Coming up, a segment from KTWU, your source for public television. Afterwards, don't forget to visit ktwu.org to make a pledge to help make more local programming like this.
Home on the Range. It's a song most every American, and certainly every Kansan, is familiar with. In our first story, we explore the history of this famous tune and see why its appeal has lasted for so long.
I think that in America, but also just generally in the human heart, there is this longing for being in a place, being happy in a place.
Home on the Range began its life as a poem written by a bachelor doctor near Smith Center, Kansas. It would eventually spread like wildfire across the plains, ingraining itself into our culture. This anthem of the West is arguably the most recognizable song in America, perhaps even the world. And it all began around 1872, when Dr. Brewster Higley sat down in his dugout and penned a poem called Western Home.
Brewster Higley was a doctor who retired from his practice in Indiana, and he just wanted to get away from it all. And so he came to Kansas, and he was a typical, well, a sort of a typical bachelor homesteader. There were a lot of those who came out here.
So he came out to Smith Center, Kansas, and he was one of these, what they used to call writing doctors. And they had writing lawyers and they had writing professionals, people who were just attracted to or obsessed by poetry, and they wrote it. And oftentimes they would get it published in the local newspaper, or they would send it to friends, or they would show it to people. And evidently Dr. Brewster Higley, when he was working on a couple of guys, showed him the poem called Western Home. And they loved it, and they said, you really ought to get this set to music. And so he took it into town, and there was a local guy named Dan Kelly, who was a construction person, kind of entrepreneur in Smith Center. And he was also a musician and part of this band, I guess it was called, the Harlan Brothers Orchestra. And he set it to music, and it started being sung around, and it was first published in 1873, then in the Smith County Pioneer.
When it was originally written, the way they sang it was a little bit different. They used to sing, "Oh home, oh home, where the deer and the antelope play." Very different. In fact, it did not even have the words "home on the range." Then, as the years went by, cowboys learned this song, and they started travel. They were traveling all across the West.
One of the very first corruptions, if you will, of the original poem was to call it Home on the Range, and to turn the word range into a noun instead of as it is in My Western Home or in Western Home, where it is just a verb.
I would not exchange my home here to range. That's how it originally went. And so the word range was a verb, to range, to go out, you know, traveling away from my home. Well, some cowboy somewhere who was feeling at home on the range, the noun, the range, just switched those words around a little bit. And he sang, I would not exchange my home on the range. And then the rest is history.
Around 1910, a folklorist named John Lomax printed a version of Home on the Range he'd heard in Texas, setting the standard for the words and melody we know today.
When John Lomax printed that song in a book, it was kind of set in stone, and that song hasn't changed appreciably since that time.
Then, on the night he was first elected president, Franklin D. Roosevelt heard a group of reporters singing Home on the Range and mentioned to them it was his favorite song. Radios across the country began playing it, and soon Home on the Range was a hit.
It became nationally popular, and once radio started, it became popular on the radio. And that's when money got into it. And that's when Home on the Range really sort of became discovered, and Dr. Brewster Higley became discovered.
In 1934, a lawsuit brought by William and Mary Goodwin of Tempe, Arizona, claimed copyright of the song they say they'd written in 1905 as an Arizona home.
So they brought out a lawyer who started sniffing around. He went through the whole West interviewing people, and he finally ended up in Smith County, where he tracked that song down, and they figured it was written around 1872 or so. And at that point, the song became sort of a product of Kansas.
Once the true origin of the song was uncovered, many Kansans began to lobby to make Home on the Range the official state song, an idea not without controversy.
Not everybody liked the idea of Home on the Range being the Kansas state song. They thought it was too slow and sort of maybe a little bit sad sounding.
There were some legislators who objected to the sort of prairie, bucolic nature, pastoral nature of the poem. They wanted to paint a more economically thriving or, modern image of the state at that time. By that time, Home on the Range was so affectionately planted in the hearts of Kansans that legislators who didn't like it were instantly voted against in the final analysis. So it was, in fact, made the state song in 1947. Dr. Brewster Higley's Western Home is really about home at the same time that it's about the openness and about the range. In other words, it's about the natural landscape, but it's also about a home there, and building a home there and having a home there, which is part of what people wanted when they came to Kansas, but at the same time, they sort of wanted the openness as well. So that's been one of the ambivalences of pioneering altogether. To make a life, you have to spoil, in some ways, the natural beauty of a place.
Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day.
Here's what Kirk Meacham, writing in the Kansas State Historical Society's Kansas Historical Quarterly in 1949, just after it had become the state song, he wrote, "Somehow, out on the lonely prairie, an obscure poet and an unknown singer created an artistic paradox, a perfect blending of man's nostalgia for home and his dreams of some faraway and fairer land. This ambivalent masterpiece has turned out to be the ideal expression of the love which Kansans feel for their unpredictable state." Good one.
Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day.
Glad you could stop by to see a clip from KTWU. It's your input that helps make public television great. Consider a donation. Browse over to ktwu.org right now.